No matter who wins this year's presidential election in the United States, American entrepreneurs and investors doing business overseas are already at a disadvantage compared to their counterparts from almost any other country in the world. Trump may make some things worse, Biden may make other policies worse. Today, I'm going to run down the top 3 areas I think entrepreneurs should be focused on and how each area would change under a Trump re-election or a Biden election. Hi, I'm Andrew Henderson, and here at Nomad Capitalist, we've taken my more than a dozen years of on-the-ground field experience all around the world to build a network and to build a team of almost 30 people who help 7- and 8-figure entrepreneurs go where they're treated best legally. You can learn more at nomadcapitalist.com. And today I want to talk about the Trump versus Biden showdown and how that's going to affect American entrepreneurs who are doing business overseas. Because one thing that you know if you've watched our channel is if you're from the U.S., you are subject to taxes, to regulations, all sorts of different rules, even if you're not in the United States, that affect you. Other people from other countries don't have all these strings attached to them. And what I've been talking about that's garnered me quite a bit of cynicism is the idea that not a lot from my perspective as a former American who spent a lot of years overseas as a U.S. citizen, not a lot is going to change regardless of who gets elected. The system is not set up in the United States for people who live overseas. It is not largely a country of immigrants who leave. It is not Ireland. It is not the Philippines. It is not any of the other countries where, even the UK, people leave and they're cool with that. There is almost a toxicity for people who leave the country in the eyes of some in the political class. And so regardless of who wins, you're still going to be at a disadvantage as a U.S. citizen. But I want to talk about 3 areas that people I know and people I work with have commented on that I think are important to be aware of. And the first area is what's going to happen to the financial regulations under Trump or Biden. I'm talking about the policy of citizenship-based taxation, where Americans simply cannot relinquish their tax residence by moving overseas. If you're an American and you move to Dubai, you're just going to pay taxes subject to any kind of foreign tax credits or treaties, subject to the foreign earned income exclusion. You can certainly reduce your taxes, particularly as an entrepreneur. I'll get to that in a moment. But in terms of this policy of always having to phone home, as it were, always having to file taxes, having to pay something, even if it's less, I don't believe that's going to change under either president. Biden has not talked about getting rid of it. Almost none of the candidates in 2016 on the Democratic side talked about getting rid of it, except there were some whispers that perhaps Bernie Sanders thought it was kind of unfair because we should always be like all the other countries in the Western world. And so I think that Trump has had 4 years to get rid of that. But to me, again, I've been criticized for saying this, but in an America First world, you can be for America First, that's fine. But in an America First world, why wouldn't you want your own citizens to come back to the United States and contribute to the economy? Why wouldn't you want people like me to come back and live in the U.S. and pay the reduced, slightly reduced if you are a top earner, but reduced taxes in the United States? Why would you want people to be going over and building other countries? That's really fundamentally what many people in the Trump administration are against. Do you think Steve Bannon likes the fact that I'm contributing to the economy of Malaysia? He said he's shocked and he's chagrined by how Asian economies built a middle class since the 90s. And that's the very premise of what it is that we talk about here, that you can go and live in these countries that have built a middle class and have become highly livable in my lifetime. And so I don't believe that either candidate is going to end citizenship-based taxation. The other issue is FATCA, the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, where banks all around the world, foreign financial institutions, now have to also phone back to the IRS and report to the Treasury what bank accounts, what financial accounts U.S. citizens or those with U.S. indicia, have at their banks. I go to open bank accounts still. Prove that you're not a U.S. citizen, because right here in your passport it says you were born in the U.S., so prove to us that you weren't. Okay, here's my proof. But I think that, sometimes banks don't entirely understand that, and they're sending information even on former U.S. citizens back to the U.S. government. And so, again, Trump had his chance to end this. Haven't really heard much about it. There's always one or two Republicans in Congress who's talking about doing it. But really nothing's changed, and I don't see any political capital from a more progressive Biden administration to remove that because, it's much like political ads where politicians have said he offered tax breaks to companies that shipped jobs overseas. It's an oversimplified statement, but there is some truth to that in our world. I'm often telling people that I'm working with, the fewer U.S. workers you have, the better. It's easier, makes things easier. And so, sure, there's some truth to that. They oversimplify it, but imagine how someone who got rid of FATCA would be labeled as a guy who facilitated tax cheating. Even though I don't think it's been successful in accomplishing that. It's been successful in, having women who live in France and work as nurses get their bank accounts closed, or guys who work as accountants in Switzerland have their mortgages called and, have to figure out how to pay their mortgage off. But I don't know how much extra revenue it's brought in or if it's been worth it and the standing of the U.S. being ruined around the world, but neither candidate wants to end those two things, in my opinion. Now, step two is something that Trump introduced, which is this new regime where if you're doing business overseas, you have to pay a certain amount of tax or else we're going to tax you. And I've seen more rumblings of this in other countries where I do think that you'll see other countries besides the United States implement a similar policy for personal income tax. So where, for example, if you're Australian and you live overseas and you pay enough tax for our liking, you're good. If you pay zero, we got a problem. Send us a certain percentage that we deem the minimum. There's a lot of talk of global minimum tax among Western countries right now. And so even if you're not American and you're watching this, don't get too excited because I think that these policies may expand. But in the policy of things like GILTI, which has affected businesses from the U.S. that operate around the world, where there's a minimum tax, Trump said, listen, you're going to pay in the low double digits in tax. Biden now wants to raise that several percentage points. So I don't think Trump's going to get rid of something in his hastily passed Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. I don't think that Biden is going to go in and change that because his policy is let's make people pay an even higher rate of minimum tax. And so if you're watching this and saying, well, okay, what's so bad about having to pay at least 14% or having to pay at least, if I'm operating in another country, 28, or if not, I'll pay the 14 to the U.S. I'm simplifying this. But what's so bad about that? After all, Joe Biden wants to raise the corporate tax rate back up to, I think, 28%. He wants to raise the highest personal income tax rate to almost 40%. He wants to take the cap off Social Security and Medicare. So if you're self-employed, you run your own business, you make over $400,000 a year, get ready for unlimited Social Security contributions. The same way they took the cap off Medicare decades ago, now it's coming off Social Security. Okay, it's like, let's not walk out into the pouring rain. Let's stay in the burning building. Those are now your two choices. You're either going to pay, or you're either going to have to pay more overseas or have to pay more in the U.S. Either way, I just don't think that taxes are going to go down for Americans, including those overseas. The third area that I do see as relevant is complication, is complexity. And I have had people that we've worked with where I've said, listen, you have a complicated business. We can move it offshore. We can comply with all these new policies that exist. And we can do it very well, and you can achieve a lot of tax savings. But you know what? The structure is going to be so complicated that you're going to need experts in these 3 different countries. I can provide those guys, but you know what they're going to charge you every year? I had one guy, he ran a business, made a couple $1 million a year. I said, it's going to cost you 50 or 60 grand a year to do your taxes. And so I think that anything Trump wanted to introduce, my thought is probably has been introduced. You won't see some of this stuff go away, but you probably won't see more complexity being overseas. And you certainly aren't going to see more complexity on the domestic tax side. Republicans, you'd think they had their chance to do their taxes on the back of a postcard that they, talked about. Estonia managed to figure it out, and Jeb Bush talked about that in the 2016 election. Why can't we do our taxes on a postcard like Estonia? I've been hearing that phrase since the 1990s when I was a kid looking at politics. Let's have taxes on the back of a postcard. Well, they're in control now, and they haven't done it. I think that Biden potentially, if you're overseas, could make it more complicated by making new forms, making things more complicated. I don't have a lot to go by, but when I read about the stuff that he wants to do, I think that perhaps might introduce more complexity. And if you're overseas, This is the thing that the media never talks about. Everyone says people are giving up their citizenship for taxes. You know what? I think just as many, if not more people, the average middle class or upper middle class person who's got a job or a small business who just wants to be left alone because it's crushing him to comply with the laws in his country where he lives, as well as with the U.S. where he's from. Do you know what their issue is? It's not taxes, because they're already living in a country where they're paying taxes for the most part. The big issue is it's just too bloody difficult to do my taxes and to keep up with everything. I can tell you personally, part of the, one of the many factors that pushed me over the edge was, I'm afraid, man. I would go over my filings with a fine-tooth comb. I had one bank where I had so many accounts opened and closed. I had 11 different accounts at that bank, and I'm like, oh, I gotta go and look and make sure I did it properly. I was so, because people make fun of me, I'm the goody two shoes of the offshore business. I wanted to be so compliant, and now I can just breathe easily. Oh, the bank made a mistake. They changed my account number. Oh, what do I care? I don't have to report it to anybody. It was so stressful, and the complexity. Imagine you're the guy who has a business, a couple $1 million a year. Obviously it's very successful, but it's not like, this is not like he's a billionaire or something. It's just a relatively successful kind of everyday online business. And imagine you've got a $60,000 tax bill because you decided to go and live in Europe and lower your taxes, and you had to comply with the U.S. And if you weren't a U.S. citizen, your tax bill would be like $3,000. That would be like the bill for doing the rest of the accounting in the other countries involved, like $3,000 or $4,000. So imagine how stressful that can be. I think that potentially under a Biden administration, that could be more difficult with all the things that he wants to roll out. So complexity could be an issue. It's the one that nobody talks about because they all want to stick to the narrative of people don't want to pay taxes. Well, sure, we don't. And yes, I think you should be able to live overseas and live by other countries' tax rules, including the fact that certain countries, whether it's the UAE, Monaco, or anywhere else, gets to say our tax rate's 0. Why not? That should be allowed. But, to say that it's only about taxes, the bigger issue often is paperwork, and I think that's one thing that could be worse under President Biden. So I think those are 3 things that you want to be aware of. If you have a comment on one of those, I want to hear your feedback below. What do you see coming in the next 4 years? How can Nomad Capitalist help you? 4 ways. Number 1, subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell to make sure you get our new video every day. Number 2, get a copy of Nomad Capitalist, the book. You'll learn a lot of my personal experiences over a dozen years of studying this stuff, as well as exactly some of the strategies that you can use to build your Nomad Capitalist plan. Number 3, if you're not sure where to start, but you want to come and learn from my team and I, you want to come and mingle with like-minded people, learn more about our live conference, Nomad Capitalist Live. It's coming up soon. And number 4, if you want some help right now because you've got a burning issue, you need something solved, you want to lower your taxes, get a second passport, or build the Nomad Capitalist lifestyle of your dreams, go to nomadcapitalist.com and click on Become a Client.